Hello everyone, my name is Owen, and welcome to the 5th episode of Magic Monday, where I talk about anything and everything related to the popular trading card game Magic the Gathering. This week's episode will be centered around a deck that I hold near and dear to my heart, the very first Commander deck I ever built. The original deck was taken apart years ago, and the deck list lost to time, but I recently rebuilt it, new and improved, and I'm excited to share it with you guys today. This explanation will also be split up into a couple of different parts, or categories, just to make it a bit easier to understand. The name of this deck is Gave, Guru of Fair and Reasonable Combos. Evidently, the commander will be Gave, Guru of Spores. This bad boy is a 5 mana 0/0, costing 2 generic, a white, a black, and a green mana. And he enters the battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters on him. This isn't the important part though, as he has 2 abilities that are extremely essential to our deck. The first ability allows you to pay 1 mana and remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control in order to create a 1/1 Sapperling token. His second ability does the opposite, letting you sacrifice a creature you control in order to put a +1/+1 counter onto another creature you control. Gave is extremely notorious for going infinite with tons of different cards, immediately winning games. It was this immediate win aspect of the card that I really disliked, so when building this deck, I strived to remove any card that could potentially go infinite with him. As such, the goal of this deck is to win the game using only fair and reasonable combos, no matter how mean they may be. This deck's primary color is green, so of course we have to run cards like Rampant Growth, which lets us search our library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped, and Farseek, which lets us search our library for any land that isn't a forest and put it into play tapped. Other notable ramp cards include Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, both of which allow you to search your library for 2 basic land cards, put one into your hand and the other into play tapped. We're also running Nature's Lore, which lets us search our library for a forest and put it into play, and Skyshroud Claim, which lets us search our library for 2 forests and put them into play. Then there's Sol Ring, which we can tap to add 2 colorless mana, and Arcane Signet, which taps for either black, green, or white. Finally, we have Mirari's Wake, which will give us an additional mana whenever we tap one of our lands. It also gives all of our creatures +1/+1, which helps us beef up our board. These cards will not only help us build our board in the early game, but also provide us with extra resources in the late game. All that mana sure is cool, but what are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to cast creatures, of course. First up on our creature list is Tendershoot Dryad. Tendershoot Dryad creates a Sapperling on each upkeep, as well as gives all of our Sapperlings +2/+2 if we have the City's Blessing. This deck makes a ton of Sapperlings, and buffing them up can quickly make us a massive threat. To help with this is Thalanite Hermit, an elf that also buffs up our Sapperlings, and can create 4 of them if we flip it up with Morph. There's also Psychotrope Thallid, which lets us pay 1 and sacrifice a Sapperling to draw a card, and Savage Thallid, which lets us sacrifice a Sapperling to regenerate a fungus. This next card isn't technically a creature, but it sure does make a lot of them. Fungal Sprouting will create X Sapperling tokens where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. This synergizes extremely well with Gabe's ability to make himself bigger, and it can sometimes win games if you play it at the right time. Now onto our big beaters. Starting out, we have Michaeloth. When it enters the battlefield, we can sacrifice any number of creatures to give it twice that many +1/+1 counters, and on our upkeep, it creates Sapperling tokens equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it. Since we have no shortage of creatures to sacrifice, we can make Michaeloth really big, and it can exponentially grow our board if it isn't dealt with. Next up, there's Butcher of Malakir, one of the meanest cards in our deck, which will make each opponent sacrifice a creature whenever we do. This will decimate opponents' boards, leaving them wide open for our creatures to attack. Then there's Chatterfang, Squirrel General, who makes 1/1 squirrels whenever we create tokens. He also lets us sacrifice squirrels to give creatures -X/-X, where X is the number of squirrels sacrificed. This not only serves as a token doubler, but also as amazing removal, being able to kill even indestructible creatures. But, while these cards are good, they're nothing without their synergies, which brings us to the next category. First up, we have Anointed Procession and Parallel Lives, both of which state that whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under our control, we create twice that many tokens instead. Both of these cards will rapidly accelerate the growth of our board, but pale in comparison to the next card, Doubling Season. Not only does Doubling Season double our tokens, but it doubles our counters as well. This works particularly well with our commander, who will enter play as a 10/10 if this card is on the battlefield. Then we have Intangible Virtue, which gives all of our creature tokens +1/+1 in Vigilance, allowing us to attack more often without fear of retribution. This is all great, but it's only half of this energy pie. We'll cover the rest in our next category. Starting out, we have Hardened Scales, which gives us an additional +1/+1 counter whenever we place one or more +1/+1 counters on a creature, followed by Winding Constrictor, which does the same thing, except it applies to any type of counter. Then we have Mazarek Crowl Death Priest, which gives each of our creatures +1/+1 counter whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, and Cathar's Crusade, which will give each of our creatures a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control. Next, we have Corpsejack Menace, which, similar to Doubling Season, will double any +1/+1 counters that we place on a creature. Finally, we have the Ozolith and Rayhan, Last of the Abzan, which both let us store +1/+1 counters from creatures that have died and move them around to new creatures. All of these cards synergize extremely well with our commander, helping us beef him up into a big attacker. But this attacker is useless if we can't protect him, leading us to our fifth category. First up, there's Asceticism, which gives all of our creatures hexproof and allows us to pay 1 and a green to regenerate one of our creatures. For mass protection, we have Rootmore Defenses, which gives all of our creatures indestructible until end of turn, and Heroic Intervention, which will do the same, except it also gives hexproof. Next up is Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, both of which will protect our commander from being targeted in one way or another. These cards will help us protect our board once we become a threat to our opponents, making it easy to swoop in for the kill. Every good deck is going to need some ways to deal with opposing threats, so I've stocked up on the very best removal available. First up, we have Path to Exile, letting us exile a creature an opponent controls, but getting them a basic land to the battlefield tapped. Next, we have Anguished Unmaking and Vindicate, which will let us destroy a permanent our opponent controls. Then there's Beast Within, which lets us destroy a permanent at the cost of giving that player a 3/3 beast, and Assassin's Trophy, which, similar to Path to Exile, will let us remove a permanent while giving our opponent a basic land. In terms of mass removal, we will be running Vanquish the Horde, a board wipe that costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. We'll hopefully be making a lot of creatures so we can cast it cheaply in times of dire need. Another amazing card in this deck is Aura Shards, which says that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we may destroy an artifact or enchantment. Our commander is going to be pumping out a lot of creatures, so this basically is an on-command artifact or enchantment removal spell. Last, but definitely not least, we have what I'd consider to be the best card in the entire deck. Mana Tithe. Okay, now you might be a little shocked, but hear me out. This card definitely isn't the best in terms of power or value, but it is the best in terms of fun. Mana Tithe is one of the most unexpected cards that you could play in this type of deck, and trust me, there's nothing better than the look on somebody's face after you counter your game-winning play with this, to say the least, horrible card. There are a surprising amount of situations that Mana Tithe can be used in, and it's definitely a must-have in this deck. Now, Mana Tithe is clearly the best card, as we can all agree, but it's completely useless if it's just sitting in our deck, doing nothing. Fortunately for us, we have all of the cards in the next category to help us out. First up to bat is Benny Brack's Zoologist. He says that at the beginning of each end step, if we created a token this turn, we can draw a card. Since our commander can make tokens at instant speed, this basically means that we can draw a card every single turn. Then we have Fecundity and Moldervine Reclamation, both of which let us draw a card whenever a creature we control dies. Be careful when playing Fecundity though, since all players can benefit from its effects. Death Reap Ritual is similar to the previous two cards, but it only triggers on end step if a creature died this turn. Next, there's Rumor Gatherer, which will allow us to scry one and draw one if we create 2 tokens. Finally, we have our 2 powerhouse card drawers, with Skullclamp and Sylvan Library. Skullclamp is an equipment that gives the equipped creature +1/-1, and when that creature dies, we draw 2 cards. But if we equip it to a 1/1 creature, say a Saproling, then that creature would die immediately, giving us 2 cards for effectively free. Then there's Sylvan Library, a 2-mana enchantment that lets us pay life to draw more cards on our draw step. But wait, that's not all. We may have finished with the card draw, but there's still another way of getting cards from the deck, and that's... First up, we have an oldie but a goodie, and that's Enlightened Tutor. This card lets us search our library for an artifact or enchantment and put it onto the top of our deck. Similarly, Idyllic Tutor lets us search for just an enchantment, but it goes straight to our hand. Then, for our more general needs, there's Diabolic Intent and Beseech the Queen. Diabolic Intent lets us search our library for any card, but at the cost of sacrificing a creature. And Beseech the Queen has us search for any card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands we control. These 4 cards can fetch some of the best cards in our deck, straight to our hand, with little to no restrictions. Now we have the cards that I wasn't really able to place in any one category. They may not have a home, but don't rule them out, because they're some of the strongest cards in the deck. First, there's Aetherworks Marvel, which says that whenever a permanent we control dies, we get an energy counter. We can spend 6 energy counters to look at the top 6 cards of our library and play one of them for free. This is super powerful, since we'll be sacrificing creatures all the time, and being able to get a card onto a battlefield for free can be super game-changing, especially when you can activate it more than once. Next, we have Eldrazi Monument, which gives all of our creatures +1/+1 flying and indestructible, but we have to sacrifice a creature at the beginning of each of our upkeeps. Luckily, we have no shortage of cannon fodder at any given time, so this card basically has no downside. Then there's Grave Pact. This is by far one of the most evil cards in the deck, stating that whenever a creature we control dies, every other player has to sacrifice a creature as well. This can easily wipe opponents' boards, and because it's an enchantment, it sticks around, preventing them from building any meaningful board states. Overall, just a super powerful card. Then we have Illusionist's Bracers, an equipment that copies the activated abilities of the equipped creature. Since our commander has 2 abilities that are activated abilities, this card will give us huge value if we equip it to him. Smothering Tithe is another super mean card that I've included, that when played will be sure to make you the primary target of the game. Smothering Tithe says that whenever an opponent draws a card, if they don't pay 2 mana, you will get a treasure token. Not only does this serve as ramp for you, but it can pressure opponents into spending mana on effectively nothing. Next, we have some less notable, but still pretty good cards, with Spider Silk Armor and Night Soil. Spider Silk Armor gives all of our creatures +0/+1 in reach, letting us block flying creatures, and Night Soil serves as our graveyard hate while also making saprolings. You may have noticed that a lot of our deck is made up of some really powerful artifacts and enchantments, and when those are removed, this can be a big problem for us. To counteract this, I've included Brilliant Restoration and Noxious Revival. Noxious Revival, which allows us to return any one card from the graveyard to the top of our deck, will serve as quick and cheap recursion should only one of our heavy hitters be taken down. Brilliant Restoration, on the other hand, returns all artifacts and enchantments from the graveyard to the battlefield all at once. This card can quickly turn the tides of the battle heavily in our favor, should a lot of our powerful cards get removed. This video is already running pretty long, so I'm not going to talk about the lands, since none of them are super important to our game plan. However, if you would like to see a full list of included lands, as well as take a closer look at the deck itself, the link to the full deck list will be in the description below. Feel free to take a peek. Now that we've reached the end of our list, let's tally up the price. This deck totals out to a whopping $734, not a cheap price tag by any means. I sure hope you weren't expecting a budget deck. Despite the massive price tag of this deck, it is still super fun, so be sure to tell me your thoughts on it in the comments below. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed this week's video, as well as the deck that came with it. If you do decide to look past the price tag and build this deck, please tell me what you think of it. I'm super excited to hear everybody's thoughts. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. These videos take a lot of work to make, so every bit of support counts. So, to all of you still here, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week.